The general's hand cracked across her face like a rifle shot, the sound echoing through the mesh hall where 347 soldiers sat frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. Private First Class Zara Kelmont didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She didn't even blink. She just turned her head slowly back to face General Augustus Thorne, her cheek burning red with his handprint, and said 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Sir, you just made a mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." What happened next took exactly 5 seconds. 5 seconds for a decorated 4-star general to go from towering over what he thought was the weakest soldier in the Crimson Ridge Military Academy to being driven to his knees, gasping for air, begging for mercy from a woman he just humiliated in front of nearly 400 witnesses. 5 seconds for everything the military brass thought they knew about Private Kelmont to shatter like glass hitting concrete. Because Zara Kelmont wasn't weak. She wasn't a struggling recruit who could barely complete a push-up that everyone believed her to be. She was something else entirely, something none of them had bothered to look deep enough to discover. And when General Thorne's palm connected with her face that Tuesday morning in the North Wing dining facility, he didn't just cross a line. He triggered a response that would become legendary in military circles for decades to come. The slap itself was born from 3 months of mounting frustration. General Thorne had been watching Kelmont fail at everything. Physical training scores in the bottom 5%, marksmanship that couldn't hit a target at 50 meters, combat simulations where she seemed to freeze under pressure. To him, she represented everything wrong with the military's new inclusive policies. A charity case taking up space that belonged to a real soldier. But what General Thorne didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every failure had been deliberate. Every missed shot, every failed exercise, every moment of apparent weakness had been carefully calculated performance art. Because Zara Kelmont hadn't come to Crimson Ridge to prove herself to anyone, she'd come to disappear. Before Crimson Ridge, she'd been Staff Sergeant Zara Chun Kelmont of the 75th Ranger Regiment's most classified unit. Before that, she'd been the woman who'd single-handedly extracted 12 hostages from a terrorist compound in the mountains of Cathar Province while taking fire from 3 directions. Before that, she'd been an operative who'd spent 2 years embedded in the underground fighting circuits of Eastern Europa, learning close-quarters combat techniques that weren't taught in any military manual. But after what happened in Volov City, after the mission that went so wrong, it was wiped from official records. She requested the most anonymous assignment possible, a place where she could fade into the background and pretend to be ordinary. Crimson Ridge Academy seemed perfect, a training facility for new recruits, where she could play the struggling soldier while processing the things she'd seen and done in the shadows. The performance had been flawless for 93 days. She'd mastered the art of being unremarkable, invisible, forgettable. She'd learned to miss targets she could have hit blindfolded, to struggle with equipment she could disassemble and reassemble in her sleep, to look confused during tactical briefings she could have taught better than the instructors. And it might have stayed that way forever if General Augustus Thorne hadn't decided to make an example of her. Thorne was old military, the kind who believed discipline came from humiliation and strength was measured by how much punishment you could absorb. He'd been circling Kelmont for weeks like a predator, making comments about her performance in front of other recruits, assigning her extra duties designed to break her spirit, pushing and pushing and pushing until she would either quit or prove she belonged. The morning of the incident, she'd been late to formation by 30 seconds. Traffic from a minor vehicle accident had delayed the transport from the barracks. But Thorne didn't care about explanations. He'd dressed her down for 10 minutes in front of the entire company, questioning her dedication, her intelligence, her right to wear the uniform. But it was in the mess hall where his patience finally snapped. Kelmont had been sitting alone as usual, picking at her breakfast when she accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice. The liquid splashed across the table and dripped onto the floor. A minor accident, nothing more. Thorne had been walking past when it happened. He stopped, stared at the mess, then at her, and something in his expression shifted. This wasn't about discipline anymore. This was about power, about dominance, about putting someone he saw as inferior in their place. "Stand up, Private," he commanded, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall. She'd stood, still holding her napkin, still trying to clean up the spill. "You can't even eat breakfast without making a mess," he'd said loud enough for everyone to hear. "How do you expect to function in combat? How do you expect to protect the soldiers beside you when you can't even handle a glass of juice?" The mess hall had gone dead quiet. 347 soldiers, kitchen staff, and junior officers watching as a 4-star general verbally destroyed a private over spilled juice. And that's when he'd raised his hand and struck her across the face with enough force to echo off the walls. Now, before we show you exactly how Private Zara Kelmont transformed from the Academy's biggest failure into its most feared legend, and what General Thorne's final words were before he was led away in disgrace, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because what happened next didn't just end one man's career. It rewrote the rules about who gets to hold power and who gets underestimated. Today, she didn't prove her strength with words or warnings or second chances. She proved it in 5 seconds that no one at Crimson Ridge Academy would ever forget. But before we dive into the full story of how Private Zara Kelmont went from Academy failure to legend in 5 devastating seconds, we need you to be part of this incredible journey. Right now, pause the video and drop a comment telling us which country you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States? Maybe you're joining us from the UK, Australia, Canada, or somewhere completely different. We love seeing our global community come together around these powerful stories of justice and hidden strength. And here's what we really want to know. Have you ever been in a situation where someone in authority completely underestimated you? Have you ever had to bite your tongue while someone with power treated you like you didn't matter? Tell us about it in the comments, because today's story is going to resonate with anyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or humiliated by someone who thought they were untouchable. Make sure you smash that like button if you believe that respect has to be earned, not demanded. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell, because we're building a community of people who understand that real strength isn't always visible on the surface. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. Now, in just a moment, we're going to show you the exact sequence of moves that brought a 4-star general to his knees. We're going to break down those 5 seconds frame by frame and reveal the military background that Zara Kelmont had been hiding from everyone at Crimson Ridge Academy. But first, you need to understand how we got to that moment in the mess hall and why everything that happened next was inevitable from the second General Thorne decided to make Zara his target. Because this story begins 3 months earlier on a rain-soaked morning when a woman with enough classified kills to terrify a cartel walked through the gates of Crimson Ridge, pretending to be the weakest recruit they'd ever seen. Proceed with part 3, without include title. Make sure that each part at least 800 Tomousson words. Write TH from 11 part of story. Please make sure you don't do any overlapping and rewriting. The rain hammered against the reinforced glass windows of the Crimson Ridge Military Academy administration building like machine gun fire, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments before sliding down the bulletproof surface. It was E05 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning in late September, and the sprawling complex of concrete and steel that housed America's most elite military training facility was just beginning to stir with its daily rhythm. Crimson Ridge wasn't like other military mines, built into the rocky coastline of Northern California, 2 hours north of San Francisco. It served a very specific purpose, taking soldiers who had already proven themselves in basic training and forging them into something harder, sharper, more lethal. The facility could house up to 800 personnel at any given time, but typically ran with around 600 active trainees, 150 instructors, and 50 administrative staff. The main campus stretched across 2,400 acres of unforgiving terrain with elevation changes that could break ankles and weather patterns that shifted from fog to blazing sun to freezing rain within hours. The Pacific Ocean crashed against black rocks 300 feet below the eastern perimeter, creating a constant soundtrack of violence that reminded everyone within earshot that nature didn't care about human ambition. This particular morning carried extra weight because it marked the beginning of evaluation week, a quarterly assessment period where performance metrics were calculated, rankings were adjusted, and careers were either launched or destroyed. The academy ran on a strict hierarchy system where every soldier knew exactly where they stood in relation to every other soldier. And that ranking determined everything from meal privileges to weekend liberty to future assignment opportunities. At these 600 hours sharp, the morning formation bells would ring across the compound, calling 587 active personnel to their respective assembly points. Alpha Company would gather on the main parade ground, a massive rectangle of perfectly maintained concrete that could accommodate full battalion formations. Bravo Company would assemble near the obstacle course complex, a sprawling maze of walls, trenches, rope climbs, and crawl spaces designed to simulate every possible combat environment from urban warfare to jungle infiltration. Charlie Company, the advanced tactical unit, would form up near the weapons ranges where the staccato crack of rifle fire provided a constant reminder of the Academy's ultimate purpose. And Delta Company, the specialized operations track, would meet in the classified section of the base that didn't appear on any tourist maps or congressional oversight reports. The weather system moving in from the Pacific had been tracking for 3 days, bringing with it the kind of sustained rainfall that turned training exercises from challenging to dangerous. The obstacle courses would become mud pits. The rope climbs would be slick with water. The rifle ranges would test marksmanship skills under conditions that mimic real combat, where perfect visibility was a luxury no soldier could count on. But weather was just another variable at Crimson Ridge. The Academy's motto carved into black granite above the main entrance read, "Adversity reveals character." Every exercise, every evaluation, every moment of training was designed around that principle. Push soldiers beyond their comfort zone, beyond their perceived limitations, beyond what they thought possible, and discover what they were really made of. The administrative staff had been working since 4:30, preparing evaluation packets, updating training schedules, and coordinating with the medical team that would be standing by throughout the week. Injuries were common during evaluation week. Broken bones, torn ligaments, concussions, and stress fractures were accepted as the cost of producing elite soldiers. The medical facility at Crimson Ridge was equipped to handle everything short of major surgery, and helicopter evacuation to San Francisco General was available for anything more serious. Colonel Sander Voss, the Academy's commanding officer, had reviewed the week schedule 3 times before approving it. 22 separate evaluation modules, each designed to test a different aspect of military competency. Physical fitness standards that exceeded regular Army requirements by 40%, marksmanship tests that demanded precision under stress conditions that would break civilian shooters, tactical simulations that required split-second decision-making under circumstances where wrong choices led to simulated casualties. The kitchen staff had been preparing since 0400, cooking breakfast for nearly 600 personnel with dietary requirements that range from standard military fare to specialized nutrition plans for soldiers in peak physical conditioning programs. The mess hall at Crimson Ridge could seat 400 people simultaneously, with serving lines designed for efficiency and food preparation that met the caloric demands of soldiers burning 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day. Security patrols had been walking the perimeter since midnight, checking fence lines, monitoring electronic sensors, and maintaining the isolation that kept Crimson Ridge's training methods classified. The Academy operated under special authorization that allowed training techniques and evaluation standards that weren't approved for regular military bases. What happened at Crimson Ridge stayed at Crimson Ridge, and that secrecy was maintained by personnel who understood that their own careers depended on absolute discretion. The motor pool had 47 vehicles ready for the day training exercises, from standard Humvees to specialized all-terrain vehicles designed for reconnaissance missions. The armory had been inventoried and secured with weapons ranging from standard-issue M4 carbines to specialized sniper systems that cost more than most people's annual salaries. In the communications center, technicians monitored radio frequencies and satellite links that connected Crimson Ridge to military installations around the world. Training scenarios often included real-time intelligence feeds in coordination with active military operations, blurring the line between simulation and actual combat support. And in the classified records office, locked behind security doors that required 3 different authorization codes. Personnel files contained information that would never appear on public military records. Details about soldiers' backgrounds, psychological evaluations, and classified mission histories that determined who was selected for Crimson Ridge and who was assigned to regular military duties. This was the world that would shape the event of Evaluation Week, a pressure cooker environment where the smallest mistakes could end careers and the greatest performances could launch legends. The transport truck's brakes hissed to a stop outside Processing Building Delta, and 23 new arrivals climbed down onto the wet asphalt with the uncertain movements of soldiers entering unknown territory. Most carried themselves with the confident posture of personnel who had already proven themselves in basic training and specialized schools. They walked with their chins up, shoulders back, ready to demonstrate that they belong at America's most elite training facility. But one figure moved differently. Private First Class Zara Kelmont stepped down from the truck last, her movements cautious, almost hesitant. She was 26 years old, though her paperwork listed her as 24, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she kept tucked behind her ears and gray-green eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. At 5 feet 6 inches in and 128 pounds, she appeared almost fragile among the other soldiers, most of whom had been selected for Crimson Ridge based on exceptional physical performance metrics. Her uniform hung slightly loose on her frame, suggesting someone who hadn't quite filled out the standard military physique. The name tape across her chest read Kelmont in standard black lettering, and her rank insignia indicated she was among the most junior personnel in the incoming group. Her boots were properly shined, but showed signs of extensive wear, and she carried her duffel bag with both hands instead of slinging it over one shoulder like the others. What none of them could see was a careful performance happening beneath that unremarkable exterior. Zara moved with deliberate awkwardness, allowing herself to stumble slightly on the truck's tailgate, catching herself with a small, embarrassed smile that suggested someone still getting used to military equipment. She positioned herself at the back of the formation, head down, avoiding eye contact with the other soldiers, who were already sizing each other up and forming the social hierarchies that would define their time at Crimson Ridge. Her personnel file, safely locked in the classified records office, told a very different story than her appearance suggested. Born Zara Chan Kelmont in Portland, Oregon, to a Chinese-American mother who taught martial arts and a father who had served 3 tours with special forces before becoming a civilian contractor. Raised an IA household where discipline was measured in hours of training rather than chores, where bedtime stories included tactical scenarios, and where family vacations were survival camping trips in environments that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. But the file contained gaps, sections redacted with black ink that made it impossible to piece together a complete picture. References to specialized assignments with no details. Training certifications for weapon systems that didn't exist in standard military manuals. Medical records that mentioned injuries sustained in locations that weren't supposed to have American military presence. The truth was more complex than even the classified file revealed. For the past 4 years, Zara had been something that officially didn't exist. A member of Task Force Obsidian, a special operations unit so secret that its missions were funded through budget line items hidden in Department of Agriculture reports. Task Force Obsidian handled the operations that were too sensitive for regular special forces, too politically dangerous for CIA involvement, and too morally ambiguous for anyone with conventional military career to survive. She had spent 18 months in the underground fighting circuits of Eastern Europe, not as an American soldier, but as a drifter with a talent for violence and a willingness to take fights that other people wouldn't. Her mission had been to identify and eliminate a network of human traffickers who were using the fighting circuits to move kidnapped women across international borders. She fought in basement arenas in Prague, abandoned warehouses in Budapest, and underground clubs in Bucharest, where the only rules were that fights continued until one person couldn't get up. She'd learned Krav Maga from former Israeli commandos who taught techniques designed to kill rather than subdue. She'd trained in Filipino martial arts with instructors who had grown up in neighborhoods where knowing how to fight with knives meant the difference between coming home and disappearing forever. She'd spent 6 months in Thailand learning Muay Thai from fighters who had been competing since childhood, developing conditioning that turned her shins into weapons and her elbows into sledgehammers. But it was in the mountains of Cathra province during the mission that had ended her official military career, where she had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was let people see how dangerous you really were. The Vulov City operation had been straightforward on paper. Extract 12 American contractors who had been taken hostage by a local militia group. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance. A quick in-and-out operation that should have been completed in under 2 hours. But intelligence had been wrong. And what should have been a rescue mission had turned into a massacre that left 47 people dead and created an international incident that required congressional hearings and classified testimony. Zara had completed the mission. All 12 hostages had been extracted alive. But the method she'd used, the level of violence required to cut through 3 layers of armed resistance, had been captured on security cameras that were later seized by international media. Footage of a 125-pound American woman moving through a compound like a force of nature, neutralizing threats with precision that looked more like assassination than combat, had created problems that went beyond military discipline. The official report stated that Staff Sergeant Chun Kelmon had exceeded mission parameters and used unnecessary force in a civilian environment. The classified addendum noted that her actions had been tactically sound and had saved American lives, but that her continued service in special operations would create operational security risks. The psychological evaluation sealed at the highest classification levels concluded that she had developed combat capabilities that made her unsuitable for conventional military service, but too valuable to discharge. So they had offered her a choice. Accept reassignment to the most anonymous position available or face a medical discharge that would end her military career entirely. She had chosen anonymity, requesting assignment to a training facility where she could disappear among new recruits and spend her time teaching basic military skills while processing the things she had seen and done in the shadows. Crimson Ridge Academy had seemed perfect for that purpose, a place where she could be just another struggling soldier, unremarkable and forgettable. While she figured out who she wanted to be now that she was no longer officially a killer, the performance had begun the moment she walked through the academy's gates. General Augustus Thorne arrived at Crimson Ridge Academy, like a thunderstorm rolling in from the Pacific, all sound and fury and barely contain electrical energy that made everyone in his vicinity unconsciously check their posture and uniform alignment. At 54 years old, he stood 6 feet 3 inches and tall with the kind of broad-shouldered, barrel-chested physique that suggested a lifetime of believing that physical dominance was the foundation of all other forms of power. His uniform was immaculate in a way that only comes from decades of military discipline. Every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every ribbon and metal positioned with mathematical precision. For stars gleamed from his collar, each one representing a level of authority that most soldiers would never even glimpse from a distance. His gray hair was cut in a severe military fade that hadn't changed style in 30 years, and his pale blue eyes had the cold, evaluative quality of someone who had spent his career making decisions about other people's lives without losing sleep over the consequences. Thorne had built his reputation on what the military euphemistically called old-school leadership principles. He believed that soldiers were forged through adversity, that comfort bred weakness, and that the modern military's emphasis on psychological welfare and individual accommodation was creating a generation of warriors too soft for real combat. His commands had consistently produced soldiers with exceptional discipline and unquestioning obedience, though they had also generated unusually high rates of medical discharges, psychological counseling requests, and anonymous complaints to military oversight boards. He had come to Crimson Ridge as part of a quarterly inspection tour officially designated as a routine evaluation of training standards and facility management. But everyone from Colonel Voss down to the kitchen staff understood that this visit was really about something else entirely. Recent congressional hearings had raised questions about training methods at elite military facilities, and there were rumors of budget cuts that could affect programs like Crimson Ridge if they couldn't demonstrate measurable results. Thorne's presence was both a validation of the Academy's importance and a warning that its future depended on his assessment. He would be observing training exercises, reviewing performance metrics, and conducting personal interviews with both instructors and trainees. His final report would determine whether Crimson Ridge continued operating with its current level of autonomy and funding, or whether it would be subjected to the kind of oversight and regulation that had neutered other specialized training programs. The general's touring party included 3 junior officers whose primary responsibility was to document everything for the official inspection report, plus a civilian contractor from the Department of Defense, who specialized in training, efficiency analysis. But Thorne himself was the only opinion that mattered, and everyone at Crimson Ridge understood that their careers could be made or destroyed based on his impressions during this 3-day visit. He had been walking the facility since dawn, making notes in a leather portfolio that he carried everywhere, asking pointed questions about training protocols, equipment maintenance, and personnel management. His inspection style was thorough and unforgiving, the kind of evaluation that caught details other officers would miss and exposed weaknesses that had been carefully hidden from routine oversight. It was during his review of individual trainee performance records that Thorne first encountered the name Zara Kelmet. Her file made for troubling reading. Physical fitness scores consistently in the bottom 10% of her training class. Marksmanship evaluations that showed improvement over time, but still fell below academy standards. Combat simulation exercises where she frequently performed poorly under pressure, making tactical decisions that would have resulted in casualties in real operations. But what bothered Thorne more than her poor performance was a pattern he detected in her instructor's written evaluations. Comments like, shows potential for improvement and demonstrates good attitude despite challenges, and continues to work hard despite setbacks. The kind of language that suggested her instructors were making excuses for her failures instead of holding her accountable to military standards. To Thorne, Private Kelmont represented everything wrong with the modern military's approach to personnel management. Instead of recognizing that she lacked the capabilities necessary for elite military service and recommending her for transfer to a more appropriate assignment, the Academy was apparently investing time and resources in someone who would never meet the standards expected of Crimson Ridge graduates. He made a note to observe her performance directly during the live training exercises scheduled for the second day of his inspection. That observation had taken place during a combat simulation exercise in the Urban Warfare Training Facility, a mock city built from shipping containers and plywood that could be reconfigured to simulate different environments. Zara had been assigned to a 6-person squad tasked with clearing a building and extracting a simulated hostage while under fire from hidden opponents using paintball weapons. Thorne had positioned himself in an observation tower that provided a clear view of the entire exercise, watching through binoculars as the squad moved through their assigned route. The other 5 team members had performed competently, demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness and coordinated movement that Crimson Ridge was designed to develop. But Zara had struggled visibly throughout the exercise. She had been slow to respond to her team leader hand signals, hesitant when crossing open ground under simulated fire, and appeared confused during the building clearing phase. When the exercise concluded, her squad had failed to complete the mission within the allocated time frame, and post-exercise analysis indicated that her positioning errors had contributed to 2 simulated casualties. Watching her performance, Thorne had felt a familiar frustration building in his chest. He had seen too many soldiers like this over the years, people who had somehow slipped through initial screening processes and ended up in positions where their inadequacy endangered others. In his experience, the kindest thing to do for such individuals was to identify their limitations quickly and redirect them to roles where they could contribute without compromising mission effectiveness. But what truly irritated him was the response he observed from her instructors and fellow trainees. Instead of holding her accountable for the team's failure, they seemed to be offering encouragement and suggesting additional training opportunities. The kind of accommodation that Thorne believed was weakening military culture and creating false confidence in people who needed to understand their limitations. After the exercise, he had made another note in his portfolio: recommend immediate review of trainee selection criteria and performance standards. Private Kelmont had become, in his mind, a symbol of institutional failure that needed to be addressed directly and publicly. The confrontation had been building inevitability since that moment, though neither of them realized it yet. The tension began building during the pre-dawn hours of Thorne's second day at Crimson Ridge, when the morning formation revealed what he considered to be unacceptable lapses in military discipline. 3 trainees had arrived 30 seconds late due to a minor vehicle breakdown in the transport from the barracks, and among them was Private Kelmont, looking appropriately apologetic, but not sufficiently distressed by her failure to meet basic punctuality standards. Thorne had positioned himself prominently during the formation, making it clear that his presence was not merely observational. He stood at the front of the assembled companies, with his arms crossed behind his back, his pale blue eyes scanning the ranks, with the methodical precision of a predator identifying weakness. The morning air was crisp with the smell of ocean spray and diesel fuel from a motor pool, and his breath was visible in small puffs as he waited for Colonel Voss to complete the standard morning briefing. When the formation was dismissed for breakfast, Thorne had made a deliberate decision to follow the flow of personnel toward the mess hall rather than joining the other officers in the private dining facility reserved for senior staff. He wanted to observe the informal dynamics between trainees and instructors to see how discipline was maintained when soldiers thought they weren't being watched by someone who could end their careers. What he observed over the next hour only deepened his conviction that Crimson Ridge had developed a culture of accommodation that was incompatible with military excellence. He watched as stronger trainees carried equipment for weaker ones during transition between training areas. He observed instructors providing individual attention and modified exercises for soldiers who couldn't meet standard performance requirements. Most troubling of all, he saw evidence of what appeared to be an informal support system where successful trainees were helping struggling ones complete assignments that should have been individual evaluations of competency. Private Kelmont seemed to be at the center of this dysfunctional dynamic. During a weapons maintenance session, Thorne observed two other trainees, assisting her with tasks that were clearly designed to be completed independently. During a tactical planning exercise, he saw her receiving guidance from team members that amounted to having her work done for her. And during physical training, he watched as her assigned partner deliberately slowed his own pace to accommodate her obvious cardiovascular limitations. Each incident was minor in isolation, but collectively they painted a picture of institutional failure that went beyond individual performance issues. Thorne began to suspect that Crimson Ridge's reputation for producing elite soldiers had been artificially inflated by training methods that prioritized group cohesion over individual accountability. He made detailed notes about each observation, building what he intended to be a comprehensive case for regulatory intervention that would force the Academy to abandon its current approach and adopt standards more consistent with traditional military training philosophy. The breaking point came during an afternoon demonstration exercise designed to showcase advanced tactical medicine techniques. The scenario involved treating wounded personnel under combat conditions, with trainees required to demonstrate both medical competency and tactical awareness, while under simulated enemy fire. Zara had been selected to demonstrate basic field triage procedures, a choice that Thorne immediately recognized as pedagogical malpractice. Using a trainee with documented performance deficiencies to demonstrate critical life-saving skills sent exactly the wrong message about standards and expectations. It suggested that competency was optional, that effort was more important than results, and that the Academy was more concerned with building self-esteem than developing capability. He positioned himself prominently in the observation area, making notes as Zara moved through the exercise with what appeared to be adequate but unremarkable competency. She demonstrated proper techniques for controlling bleeding, stabilizing fractures, and evacuating casualties. But her movements lacked the confidence and efficiency that Thorne expected from soldiers who might be responsible for saving lives in actual combat situations. More problematic was the response from other trainees and instructors who offered encouraging comments and positive feedback that Thorne considered grossly inflated relative to her actual performance level. The kind of praise that created false confidence and prevented individuals from recognizing their need for additional training or alternative career paths. When the demonstration concluded, Thorne had approached the lead instructor with what he intended to be constructive criticism about the selection criteria for demonstration personnel. His comments had been diplomatically phrased, but clearly indicated his concern that the Academy was using training time inefficiently by featuring soldiers who weren't representative of the standards they claimed to maintain. The instructor's response had been politely defensive, explaining that Crimson Ridge's philosophy emphasized developing potential rather than simply showcasing existing capability, and that giving struggling trainees opportunities to demonstrate competency in controlled environments was part of their comprehensive approach to military education. That conversation had crystallized Thorne's growing conviction that Crimson Ridge had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of military training. In his experience, the goal was to identify and develop soldiers who could perform under the most demanding conditions imaginable, not to provide therapeutic experiences for individuals who needed accommodation to meet basic standards. The pattern continued through the remainder of the afternoon with multiple instances where Thorne observed what he considered to be unacceptable compromise of training rigor in service of inclusive policies that prioritize feelings over effectiveness. By evening, he had filled 17 pages of his leather portfolio with specific examples of institutional failure that he intended to highlight in his inspection report. But it was during the informal evening meal period, when he had chosen once again to observe trainee interactions rather than dining with senior staff, that his frustration finally reached a level where professional restraint became difficult to maintain. He had been watching Zara navigate the crowded mess hall with the same hesitant, uncertain movements that had characterized her performance throughout the day when she had accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice while reaching for additional napkins. The incident was trivial, the kind of minor clumsiness that occurred dozens of times daily in any military dining facility. But in that moment, watching her fumble with cleaning supplies, while other trainees offered assistance she clearly needed, Thorne saw a perfect microcosm of everything that was wrong with modern military culture. Here was a soldier who couldn't complete basic tasks without help, being treated as if her limitations were acceptable rather than disqualifying in an institution that was supposed to be developing America's most capable warriors. The rage that had been building throughout his inspection finally found its focus, and Thorne made a decision that would define the remainder of his military career. The orange juice spread across the metal table in a slow amber wave, cascading over the edge in a steady drip that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the immediate area. Zara stared at the growing puddle for a moment, her face showing the kind of embarrassed frustration that comes from drawing unwanted attention to yourself in a room full of people who are already watching too closely. She reached for her napkin, then realized it was already soaked through, and began looking around for additional cleaning materials. Her movements were careful, deliberate, the actions of someone who understood that even minor mistakes could have consequences in an environment where every action was evaluated and judged. 2 tables away, Private Rodriguez started to stand, clearly intending to help with the cleanup, but something in the atmosphere made him pause halfway to his feet. The normal sounds of the mess hall, conversations, the clatter of utensils against metal trays. The background hum of ventilation systems had diminished to an uncomfortable level that made everyone aware they were part of something larger than a simple dining experience. General Thorne had been moving through the mess hall with the measured pace of an inspection tour, pausing at tables to make casual observations about facility maintenance and food service efficiency. But when the glass had toppled, when the juice had begun an inexorable spread across military-issued furniture, something had shifted in his demeanor that was immediately apparent to anyone with experience reading the body language of senior officers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His pace had slowed, then stopped entirely. His head had turned toward the sound with the mechanical precision of a weapon system acquiring a target. His jaw had tightened in a way that suggested the transition from professional observation to personal judgment. The moment when abstract institutional concerns became focused on a specific individual. He stood motionless for several seconds, watching Zara's efforts to contain the spill with inadequate materials, his pale blue eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made nearby personnel unconsciously adjust their own posture and behavior. The leather portfolio in his left hand remained closed, but his right hand had moved to rest against his hip in a position that military personnel recognized as barely controlled impatience. The silence expanded outward from his position like ripples on a pond as conversations died and attention focused on the unfolding drama. 347 people gradually became aware that something significant was happening, though most couldn't yet identify exactly what had triggered the change in atmosphere. Zara had found additional napkins and was methodically working to clean up the spill. Her movements efficient but not hurried, professional but not panicked. She seemed oblivious to the growing attention her accident had generated, focused entirely on the practical task of restoring the dining area to its previous condition. Her face showed mild embarrassment, but no real distress. the expression of someone dealing with minor inconvenience rather than a career-threatening incident. But General Thorne was no longer seeing a simple accident. In that spreading puddle of orange juice, in those careful cleaning motions, in the helpful expressions on nearby faces, he was witnessing a perfect crystallization of everything he believed was wrong with modern military culture. Here was a soldier who couldn't complete basic tasks without creating problems for others, being treated as if her limitations were normal rather than disqualifying. The institutional tolerance for incompetence that had been documenting throughout his inspection had found its perfect symbol in this moment of minor clumsiness, and the rage that had been building for months of congressional hearings and budget discussions and questions about traditional military values finally found its target. He began walking toward her table with deliberate slowness, each footstep audible on the polished concrete floor, the sound creating a rhythm that seemed to match the increasingly rapid heartbeats of everyone in the immediate vicinity. His posture had shifted into what military personnel recognized as command presence, the physical embodiment of authority preparing to be exercised without restraint. Conversations throughout the mess hall continued to fade as his approach became impossible to ignore. Kitchen staff paused in their duties to observe the developing situation. Junior officers at distant tables turned in their seats to get a better view of whatever was about to unfold. The normal chaos of a military dining facility gradually transformed into something resembling a formal inspection, with everyone unconsciously arranging themselves as spectators to an event they couldn't yet define. Zara had nearly finished cleaning up the spill when she became aware of the approaching footsteps. She glanced up briefly, saw the 4 stars on Thorne's collar, and immediately straightened into a more formal posture while continuing her cleaning efforts. Her expression remained calm and respectful, showing appropriate deference to senior rank, without suggesting panic or excessive concern. Private Thorne's voice cut through the remaining background noise like a blade, sharp and cold, and carrying clearly to every corner of the mesh hall. The single word hung in the air with unmistakable authority, a command that required immediate and complete attention, regardless of whatever else might be happening. Zara set down the damp napkins and came to attention beside her table, her posture correct, but not rigid. Her eyes focused at a point slightly above and to the right of Thorne's shoulder in the manner prescribed for addressing superior officers. Her face showed appropriate military bearing, alert but not defensive, ready to receive whatever instruction or correction might be forthcoming. "You can't even eat breakfast without making a mess," Thorne said, his voice pitched to carry throughout the dining facility, ensuring that his words would be heard by every person in the room. The comment was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that made it clear this was not a private correction, but a public judgment intended for maximum impact. The mess hall fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped working, creating a stillness that seemed unnatural in a space designed for activity and noise. 347 people held their breath, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed long after the immediate participants had moved on to other assignments. Zara's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, a momentary calculation that lasted less than a second before being replaced by continued military bearing. She remained at attention, waiting for the interaction to continue, her silence neither defiant nor submissive, but simply professional. "How do you expect to function in combat?" Thorne continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each word. "How do you expect to protect the soldiers beside you when you can't even handle a glass of juice?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, rhetorical demands that weren't intended to elicit actual responses, but to establish dominance and demonstrate the consequences of failing to meet his standards. Everyone in the room understood that this had moved beyond correction or instruction into something more personal and potentially destructive. And that's when General Augustus Thorne raised his hand and made a decision that would end his military career. The slap happened so fast that most witnesses would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. General Thorne's hand moved in a tight arc that started from shoulder height and connected with Zara's left cheek with sound like a gunshot echoing off the mesh hall's concrete walls. The impact was sharp, clean, and delivered with enough force to snap her head slightly to the right and leave an immediate red handprint across her pale skin. But what happened in the aftermath of that contact would be analyzed and discussed in military circles for decades to come. Zara's head returned to its original position with mechanical precision, her gray-green eyes refocusing on the point above Thorne's shoulder, where military protocol dictated they should remain during interactions with superior officers. Her expression hadn't changed. Her posture hadn't shifted. The only visible evidence of the assault was the angry red mark spreading across her cheek and a slight dilation of her pupils that suggested her nervous system had registered the attack even if her conscious mind was maintaining perfect military discipline. "Sir," she said, her voice calm and level, and carrying clearly to every corner of the silent mess hall. "You just made a mistake." The words hung in the air like a chemical reaction, waiting for a catalyst. 5 simple syllables that somehow managed to convey both perfect military respect and an unmistakable warning that the situation had fundamentally changed. Not a threat, not insubordination, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that made everyone who heard it understand that something irreversible had just occurred. General Thorne's face flushed red, his pale blue eyes widening with a mixture of shock and rage that suggested he couldn't quite process what had just happened. In 31 years of military service, no enlisted personnel had ever responded to his discipline with anything approaching challenge or defiance. The idea that a struggling trainee would dare to suggest that he had made any kind of error was so far outside his experience that he seemed momentarily paralyzed by the audacity of her response. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice rising to a pitch that bordered on shouting. His body language had shifted into something that was no longer professional military bearing, but personal. Confrontation. The posture of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses, and who was prepared to use whatever force necessary to re-establish dominance. But Zara had already begun to move. The transformation was so subtle that most observers wouldn't understand what they were seeing until it was over. Her weight shifted almost imperceptibly from her heels to the balls of her feet. Her hands, which had been positioned at regulation attention stance, relaxed slightly at her sides. Her breathing, which had been a controlled pattern taught in basic training, deepened into something more primal and efficient. Most significantly, her eyes changed. The respectful military gaze that had been focused above and to the right of Thorne's shoulder moved to make direct eye contact. And in that moment, everyone in the mess hall could see something that had been carefully hidden for 3 months of performance art. This wasn't a struggling trainee anymore. This was a predator who had decided to stop pretending to be prey. "I said, you made a mistake, sir," Zara repeated, her voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone that made experienced soldiers unconsciously check their own positioning and calculate distances to potential cover. "You cross from military discipline into personal assault. That changes the rules of engagement." The silence in the mess hall had become absolute, the kind of quiet that occurs in the seconds before explosions or earthquakes. When even unconscious sounds like breathing and heartbeats seemed to pause in anticipation of violence, 347 people stood frozen in their positions, aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented, but unable to predict what would happen next. General Thorne took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Zara to less than 2 feet his superior height and bulk, creating a physical intimidation that had ended countless confrontations throughout his career. His right hand was clenched into a fist, his shoulders squared for additional physical action, his entire posture broadcasting the message that this interaction would end with total submission or total destruction. "Private Kelmont," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent dining facility. "You will stand down immediately, or I will have you arrested for insubordination and assault on a superior officer. You will apologize for your inappropriate response to legitimate military discipline, and you will accept additional corrective action without further commentary." But Zara had stopped listening to his words and was instead reading his body language with the kind of tactical analysis that comes from years of life or death combat experience. She could see the tension in his shoulders that indicated preparation for another strike. She could read the positioning of his feet that showed he was planning to use his height and weight advantage to physically overwhelm her. She could detect the slight tremor in his hands that revealed adrenaline levels consistent with someone preparing for violence. Most importantly, she could see that he had fundamentally misunderstood what was happening and was about to escalate a situation that was already beyond his ability to control. "General," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried a tone that wasn't military protocol, but something older and more dangerous. You have approximately 2 seconds to step back and reconsider your next action, because what happens after that will be your responsibility, not mine. The warning was delivered with the same calm certainty as her previous statements, but now everyone in the mess hall could hear the difference. This wasn't a trainee speaking to a superior officer anymore. This was one predator acknowledging another's presence while making it clear that territory had been claimed and boundaries had been established. General Thorne's response was exactly what she expected. He reached for her shoulder with his left hand while drawing back his right for another strike. His movements telegraphed by decades of relying on physical intimidation rather than actual combat training. His technique was adequate for disciplining subordinates who couldn't resist, but catastrophically inadequate for engaging someone who had spent years learning to neutralize threats that were faster, stronger, and better armed than an aging general whose primary weapon was institutional authority. Zara's response took exactly 5 seconds from the moment his hand began to move until the moment he hit the floor. But those 5 seconds contained more technical precision, control violence, and career-ending consequences than most military personnel would witness in their entire service careers. What happened in those 5 seconds would be dissected frame by frame in classified briefings for months afterward, analyzed by combat instructors who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing on the security footage, and discussed in hushed conversations by soldiers who understood they had witnessed something that would fundamentally change how the military thought about hidden capabilities and assumed limitations. The first second belonged to General Thorne's overconfidence. His left hand reached for Zara's shoulder with the casual authority of someone who had never encountered serious resistance to his physical dominance. His movement was telegraphed obvious, the kind of grab that worked against subordinates who were constrained by military discipline and fear consequences. His right hand drew back simultaneously, preparing for another slap that would reinforce his authority and end this unprecedented challenge to his power. But Zara's response began before his hand made contact. She shifted her weight to her left foot while rotating her torso clockwise, a movement so smooth and economical that it looked almost like a natural adjustment of posture rather than the beginning of a devastating counterattack. The rotation took his reaching hand past her shoulder without contact, throwing his balance slightly forward as his momentum carried him into empty space. The second was pure biomechanics. As Thorne's body weight shifted forward, Zara's right hand came up in a tight arc that intercepted his extended left wrist. But instead of blocking or deflecting his movement, she guided it, using his own forward momentum to pull him further off balance while stepping into his now exposed center line. Her grip on his wrist was precise, thumb and fingers positioned to control the joint while applying leverage that made resistance impossible without breaking bones. Simultaneously, her left hand moved to his right elbow, not striking but controlling, redirecting the energy of his planned second slap into a position that locked his arm against his own body. The combined effect was to trap both of his arms in positions where they couldn't generate force, while using his own movement to destabilize his stance. The third second demonstrated why Task Force Obsidian had recruited her from conventional special operations. With Thorne's arms controlled and his balance compromised, Zara executed a hip throw that was textbook perfect in its application of leverage and timing. She rotated her hips underneath his center of gravity while maintaining control of his trapped arms, using his own body weight as the primary force in the takedown. But this wasn't a training exercise where the goal was to demonstrate technique without causing injury. This was survival, and Zara's application of the throw was designed to end the threat immediately and permanently. Instead of guiding him to ground in a controlled manner, she accelerated his descent, adding her own strength to his falling weight to ensure maximum impact with the concrete floor. The fourth second was a sound that everyone in the mess hall would remember for the rest of their military careers. General Thorne's body hit the polished concrete with a wet thud that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence, the sound of 230 pounds of human flesh meeting an unforgiving surface at speed. But more disturbing was the secondary sound that followed immediately afterward, a strangled gasp that began as an attempt to shout and ended as a desperate struggle to breathe. Zara had maintained control of his left arm throughout the throw, and as his body impacted the floor, she applied a joint lock that hyperextended his shoulder while simultaneously positioning her knee against the side of his neck. Not enough pressure to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to restrict blood flow to his brain and make breathing difficult. The position was clinical in its precision, designed to incapacitate without killing, while making it clear that permanent injury or death were readily available options. The fifth second was capitulation. General Thorne's right hand, which moments earlier had been preparing to strike her, began slapping frantically against the concrete floor in the universal signal of submission. His legs, which had been positioned to deliver additional physical force, were now scrambling uselessly against a smooth surface as his body fought for oxygen. His compressed, corroded arteries weren't delivering. His face had already begun to change color, shifting from red anger to purple panic as his nervous system registered that he was seconds away from losing consciousness. His pale blue eyes, which had been focused on establishing dominance, were now wide with terror as he realized that his life was completely in the hands of someone he had just physically assaulted. "Please," he gasped, the word barely audible through his restricted airway, but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the mesh hall. "Please, I can't breathe." The transformation from commanding general to helpless victim had taken exactly 5 seconds, but the image of his submission would last forever in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. This wasn't just a physical takedown. It was a complete reversal of power dynamics that demonstrated how quickly authority based on intimidation could collapse when confronted with actual competence. But what happened next revealed the true extent of Zara's professionalism and restraint. Instead of maintaining the hold until Thorne lost consciousness, instead of applying additional pressure that could have caused permanent injury, instead of taking the kind of revenge that most people would have considered justified after being publicly humiliated and physically assaulted, she released a joint lock and removed her knee from his neck with the same clinical precision she had used to apply them. General Thorne collapsed completely onto the concrete, gasping and shaking as blood flow returned to his brain and oxygen filled his lungs. His uniform was disheveled, his hair was mussed, and his face was strewn with tears of pain and terror. But he was alive, conscious, and suffering no permanent physical damage beyond bruises that would heal within days. Zara stood up slowly, her breathing slightly elevated, but otherwise showing no signs of physical stress or emotional disturbance. She straightened her uniform with quick, efficient movements, then returned to the position of attention she had maintained throughout the verbal confrontation. "Medical assistance requested for General Thorne," she announced to us all, her voice carrying clearly to the kitchen staff, who had been watching the entire confrontation unfold, appears to have fallen and may have sustained minor injuries. The clinical professionalism of her statement delivered while standing over the body of a 4-star general who was still struggling to breathe normally somehow made what had just happened even more shocking than the violence itself. 347 witnesses sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just seen, while Zara waited calmly for medical personnel to arrive and begin treating the man who had made the mistake of thinking that rank made him untouchable. The base medical team arrived within 90 seconds of Zara's request. Their response time, reflecting the kind of emergency readiness that Crimson Ridge maintained for training accidents and combat injuries. 2 corpsmen burst through the Massal doors with a wheeled stretcher and trauma kit, expecting to find the usual array of broken bones, concussions, or heat injuries that accompanied high-intensity military training. What they found instead was General Augustus Thorne sitting on the concrete floor with his back against a table leg, his uniform wrinkled and stained, his face still flushed from oxygen deprivation, and his hands shaking with the kind of tremor that comes from a nervous system that has recently processed the possibility of imminent death. He was conscious and breathing normally, but his eyes held the wide, unfocused quality of someone still processing trauma. The senior corpsman, Staff Sergeant Patricia Vance, had been treating military injuries for 12 years and had developed the kind of clinical assessment skills that allowed her to evaluate situations quickly and accurately. She took one look at Thorne's positioning, noted the absence of obvious external injuries, observed the scattered chairs and overturned table that suggested some kind of physical altercation, and began asking the kind of pointed questions that would help her understand what had actually happened. "General, can you tell me where you're experiencing pain or discomfort?" she asked while checking his pulse and examining his pupils for signs of head trauma. Her voice was professional but gentle, the tone medical personnel use when dealing with patients who may be experiencing psychological as well as physical distress. Thorne's response was barely coherent, a mumbled series of phrases about his shoulder and neck that didn't provide much useful diagnostic information. His breathing was rapid and shallow, consistent with someone recovering from a panic response, and his skin was clam in a way that suggested his body was still processing stress hormones. More significantly, when Vance asked him to explain what had happened, Thorne's gaze immediately shifted to Zara, who was still standing at attention near the scene of the confrontation. His expression showed a mixture of fear, confusion, and something that might have been recognition, as if he was beginning to understand that his assumptions about her capabilities had been catastrophically incorrect. There was an incident, he managed to say, his voice from the pressure that had been applied to his throat. I need to speak with Colonel Voss immediately. There needs to be an investigation. But even as he spoke, Thorne seemed to realize that any investigation would necessarily involve explaining how a 4-star general had ended up on the floor of a mess hall after a confrontation with junior enlisted soldier who was officially considered one of the weakest trainees at the academy. The implications of that explanation would be difficult to manage regardless of how the facts were presented. While the medical team continued their evaluation, word of the incident was spreading through the base with a speed that only military gossip can achieve. Within minutes, officers and senior enlisted personnel were arriving at the mess hall, drawn by reports that ranged from accurate descriptions of what had happened to increasingly elaborate rumors about everything from terrorist attacks to training accidents involving multiple casualties. Colonel Voss appeared 15 minutes after the initial medical response. Her uniform hastily assembled and her expression, showing the kind of controlled concern that comes from understanding that career-ending crisis can develop without warning. She surveyed the scene quickly, noted the positioning of personnel and equipment, and began the process of damage control that would determine how this incident was documented and reported to higher headquarters. Clear the dining facility, she ordered, her voice carrying clearly throughout the mess hall. All personnel except essential medical staff and designated witnesses will return to barracks immediately. This area is now under administrative control, pending completion of preliminary investigation. The evacuation was efficient and orderly, but Voss could see the expressions on the parting faces and understood that containing information about this incident would be virtually impossible. Too many people had witnessed too much, and the basic facts were too dramatic to remain secret regardless of official classification or security restrictions. Once the mess hall was cleared except for essential personnel, Voss approached Zara, who had maintained her position at attention throughout the medical response and evacuation process. Her uniform was still perfectly arranged. Her posture was still regulation correct, and her expression still showed the kind of calm professionalism that suggested someone waiting for standard debriefing procedures rather than someone who had just physically incapacitated a general officer. Private Kelmont, Voss said, her voice carefully neutral. I need you to provide a preliminary statement about the events that occurred here. This statement will be recorded and may be used in subsequent investigations. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Zara replied, her voice clear and steady. General Thorne struck me across the face during what appeared to be a disciplinary interaction. When he prepared to strike me again, I defended myself using appropriate force to neutralize the threat. At no point did I use excessive force or continue defensive action after the threat was neutralized. The statement was delivered in the kind of precise, factual language that suggested someone with extensive experience providing testimony about violent encounters. No emotional language, no subjective interpretations, just a clinical description of actions and responses that would be difficult to challenge or misinterpret. Colonel Voss made notes while Zara spoke, but her attention was focused as much on what wasn't being said as on the actual words. The complete absence of justification or explanation beyond the basic facts. The use of terminology like neutralize the threat that suggested formal training in combat engagement protocols, and the overall demeanor of someone who considered physical confrontation to be a routine professional responsibility rather than a traumatic personal experience. Private, are you currently experiencing any injuries or medical concerns as a result of this incident? Voss asked. No, ma'am. I sustained no injuries during the encounter. Do you require any medical evaluation or psychological support services? No, ma'am. I am fit for duty and available for any additional responsibilities or assignments. The exchange was becoming increasingly surreal as it became clear that the person who had apparently suffered the least trauma from the confrontation was a junior enlisted soldier who had just physically defeated a general officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. While Thorne was still being evaluated by medical personnel and would likely require several days of recovery time, Zara appeared completely unaffected by an encounter that should have been the most stressful experience of her military career. Colonel Voss concluded the preliminary interview and arranged for Zara to be escorted to secure quarters pending the arrival of investigators from higher headquarters. But as she watched the young woman walk calmly toward the exit, still maintaining perfect military bearing despite having just ended a general's career, Voss began to suspect that the official investigation would reveal far more questions than answers about who Private Kelmont really was and how she had developed the capabilities she had just demonstrated. The formal inquiry would begin within hours, but the real investigation into Zara's background and the circumstances that had brought her to Crimson Ridge would take months to complete and would ultimately reveal connections to classified programs that most military officers weren't authorized to know existed. 6 months later, the legend of what happened in the Crimson Ridge mess hall had spread far beyond the Academy's classified walls, becoming the kind of story that circulated through military networks in whispered conversations and encrypted communications. The official investigation had been completed, sealed, and filed in archives that require congressional authorization to access. But the human impact of those 5 seconds continued to ripple outward in ways that no administrative process could contain. General Augustus Thorne had submitted his retirement paperwork 36 hours after the incident, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with family. The official record showed an honorable discharge with full benefits. But everyone who mattered in military leadership understood that his career had ended the moment he hit the concrete floor of a dining facility in front of 347 witnesses. No amount of damage control or narrative management could restore the authority of a 4-star general who had been physically dominated by a junior enlisted soldier he had personally selected for humiliation. The medical report documented minor bruising and temporary soft tissue trauma, with full recovery expected within 2 weeks, but the psychological evaluation classified at levels that prevented its contents from becoming public painted a different picture. Thorne's encounter with someone whose capabilities he had fundamentally misunderstood had shattered his confidence in his ability to assess threats and manage confrontational situations. He would spend the remainder of his civilian life avoiding conflicts and questioning assumptions that had previously seemed unshakable. Private First Class Zara Kelmont had disappeared from Crimson Ridge Academy 48 hours after the incident, transferred to an assignment so classified that her new duty station didn't appear on any official military database. The cover story indicated a routine reassignment to medical training facilities, but personnel who understood classified operations recognized the signature of someone being moved to assignments that officially didn't exist. The truth was more complex than even the investigators had been authorized to discover. Within 6 hours of Colonel Voss's preliminary report reaching the Pentagon, Zara had received a secure communication from Task Force Obsidian requesting her immediate return to operational status. The incident at Crimson Ridge had demonstrated that her cover identity was no longer sustainable, but it had also proved that her combat capabilities remained at peak effectiveness despite months of enforced inactivity. Her new assignment would take her back to the world of operations that didn't exist on paper, missions that were funded through budget lines hidden in agricultural reports, and conflicts that were resolved through methods that congressional oversight committees weren't authorized to examine. But this time she wouldn't be pretending to be weak or ordinary or forgettable. This time she would be exactly what she had always been, one of the most dangerous people the American military had ever trained. The broader impact on Crimson Ridge Academy was immediate and transformative. Colonel Voss had implemented new evaluation protocols within a week. Recognizing that their existing assessment methods were inadequate for identifying personnel whose capabilities might be deliberately concealed, the assumption that struggling performance indicated limited potential had been replaced by recognition that some soldiers might have reasons for hiding their true competency levels. Training methods were revised to account for the possibility that any individual trainee might possess advanced skills that weren't immediately apparent. Instructors were provided with additional guidance on identifying signs of concealed capabilities, and new psychological evaluation tools were developed to detect personnel who might be operating under false identities or cover assignments. The mess hall where the confrontation had occurred became an unofficial shrine to the importance of never underestimating potential adversaries. New trainees were briefed on the incident as part of their orientation. Though the details were sanitized to protect classified information about Zara's actual background, the lesson emphasized was simple. Assumptions about capability based on appearance or initial performance could be fatally incorrect in operational environments. But the most significant change was cultural. The casual arrogance that had characterized interactions between senior officers and struggling trainees had been replaced by a more measured approach that recognized competency could take forms that weren't immediately obvious. The kind of public humiliation that General Thorne had attempted was no longer considered acceptable leadership, partly because of policy changes, but mainly because everyone remembered what had happened to the last person who had made that mistake. Staff Sergeant Patricia Vance, the medical corpsman who had treated Thorne after the incident, had been promoted to the Academy's senior medical officer within 4 months. Her clinical assessment of the confrontation's aftermath had been instrumental in the investigation, and her recommendations for updated medical protocols had improved the facility's ability to handle both physical injuries and psychological trauma resulting from training incidents. The other trainees who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves changed by the experience in ways they were still discovering months later. Many reported increased confidence in their own abilities, recognition that apparent weakness might conceal hidden strength, and a more nuanced understanding of how power dynamics could shift rapidly when assumptions proved incorrect. Several had requested transfers to more challenging assignments, inspired by the demonstration that extraordinary capability could exist in ordinary-seeming packages. Private Rodriguez, who had started to help Zara clean up the orange juice spill before the situation escalated, had become something of an unofficial historian of the incident. He maintained detailed notes about what he had observed, not for any official purpose, but because he understood he had witnessed something that would be discussed and analyzed for decades to come. His account had become the unofficial standard for understanding the sequence of events, since his positioning had provided him with the clearest view of the confrontation from beginning to end. The orange juice stain had been cleaned from the concrete floor within hours of the incident, but maintenance staff reported that personnel continued to pause at that particular table during meal times, as if the space itself retained some trace of what had happened there. New arrivals at the academy were inevitably directed to the exact spot where a general had learned that rank didn't guarantee dominance, and a private had proved that the most dangerous people were often the ones nobody expected. The final investigation report, classified at levels that ensured it would remain sealed for decades, concluded with a single recommendation that would influence military training policy for years to come. Assessment protocols must account for the possibility that personnel capabilities may be intentionally concealed for operational security purposes. Traditional evaluation methods are inadequate for identifying individuals whose competency has been deliberately obscured, but perhaps the most lasting impact was the simplest. Every time a senior officer was tempted to use physical intimidation against a subordinate, someone would remember what had happened to General Thorne when he made that choice. The story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that authority could substitute for actual capability, and about the consequences of underestimating people who had reasons to hide their true strength. 5 seconds had been enough to end one career and launch another, to transform institutional culture and create a legend that would outlive everyone who witnessed it. And somewhere in the classified world of operations that didn't officially exist, Zara Kelmont continued doing the work that required people to believe she was someone other than who she really was, knowing that she would never again have to pretend to be weak when someone decided to test her limits. The lesson was simple, powerful, and permanent. Respect isn't something you can demand through position or intimidation. Sometimes it's something you earn by discovering that the person you thought was helpless is actually the most dangerous individual in the room. Do you think General Thorne should have recognized the signs that Zara wasn't what she appeared to be? Have you ever encountered someone who completely surprised you with hidden capabilities? Let us know in the comments below what you think about this incredible story of hidden strength and instant justice. If you believe that real power comes from competence rather than position, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more stories of people who prove that appearances can be deceiving. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the situation demands it. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that underestimating others can have serious consequences. And check out our other incredible stories appearing on your screen right now. We'll see you in the next video with another amazing tale of justice, courage, and importance of never judging a book by its cover. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.